To give meaningful advice to any teenager is the most formidable task, for the mature male will be required to meet 3 criteria. He must do what is right, avoid the temptation to do something stupid, admit when he does wrong, and act responsibly. But I confess that I've strayed from the straight and narrow in looking randomly for hints on the subject from an advice column in a national newspaper. And it turned out to be the National Newspaper of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, published on 23rd May 2013. Just Ask Old George was not likely, in what was admittedly an act of desperation, to escape the observation of someone like myself who had been traveling for 8.5 decades. Could it be serendipity or stupidity? The episode revealed that a male subscriber had written to ask George for advice. He stated his issue. Dear George, I have good reason to believe that my neighbor's wife could be pregnant with my child. To this day, I cannot explain how it happened. She is uncertain about abortion and is trying to convince me that she would be able to get away with making her husband believe the child is his. My guilt is driving me insane. What should I do now? To cut a long story short, his explanation was that the neighborly damsel in distress had come to him for support after her husband had beaten her up. That was the only time the two had copulated. My dear teenage self, this is my advice. If you were merely to follow my example, having kids of your own is approximately 10 years away. My opinion is that a right-thinking male must, in the interest of himself and his family, have a healthy respect for women. If that attitude wasn't instilled from my teenage years, I doubt that my married life and the lives of my children would be as happy as has been the case. See what you can learn from the newspaper anecdote I've shared. Look around and observe for yourself the red flags you should avoid. Make sure that neither haste nor careless, unguarded passion is a driving force during the forthcoming critical phase of your life as you transition from teenager to responsible adulthood. Most importantly, in my lexicon, when a mature man makes a mistake, he should, as George answered, admit it. Quote from George, "You need to man up and confess your wrongs and deal with the consequences. For taking advantage of an already abusive situation is very disappointing. It's covering up a wrong that was stupidly committed. Every child should know who his or her father is, and every man should know whether or not he is in fact the biological father of a child that has been attributed to him. For time immemorial, humans have been trapped by unintended pregnancies. It is not a new phenomenon, but its consequences can be earth-shattering because of federal or state sanctions pertaining to alternative solutions, such as contraception, abortions, and the availability of good medical care in a dignified way that respects the autonomy of a woman to make decisions over her own body and consistent with personal plans for procreation. My opinion, based upon the things that I know from social interactions and court proceedings, is that our society does not encourage all the respect that is due to womenfolk. The traditional abuse and marginalization has not been seriously addressed by society. The executive, the courts, and the legislatures are paralyzed by tribal politics. Traditional forms of abuse of women and a belittling of the enormity of the problem has not been tackled in a systematic way. In fact, women have been unfairly targeted for blame and for criminal inquiry and custodial punishment, in addition to the perils of being forced to wait on near-death consequences when emergencies occur. We appear to insist that our women pay a penalty for doing what the majority of us feel they're entitled in a democracy and thoughtful society to do with their bodies, guided by a physician's advice and the blessing of their voluntary partners and doctors. Making them bear the burden of all mistakes did not have its origin in the US. It is manifest in the history of laws and literature all over the world. There is a disgusting trend within certain political conservative sectors in the US to foster the abusive and discourteous way in which women are invariably treated by US men. And it is demeaning of our democracy. that we should fail to treat womenfolk with respect and dignity as our equals. We should not impose unconscionable rules dreamed up by extremists as if they were at war against the ways, the minds, the souls, and the very body functions of a woman. Why are some males so angry about sacred maternal things and so anxious to find punishments to fit their imagined crimes? At the age of 16, I was exposed to my study of French literature, to Molière and Racine. In Molière's Le Malade Imaginaire, the irritable hypochondriac employer treats his female staff with scant respect. In Racine's compelling tragedy, Andromache was portrayed as a stereotypical weak female, whose only salvation is to be the slave or concubine of a rich and powerful male. Critics more recently admonished the wrongly portrayed Andromache, the eponymous heroine in Racine's play, because she has been depicted as a flawless and defenseless woman with no ambition, a usual racist slur, who struggles in a pathetic situation until the final coup d'etat, in which her status unexpectedly rises from that of a slave to that of a queen. We ought to deprecate this disregard for the women, but these warnings are treated with an equanimity that is undeserved because of the danger that it represents for the community at large. If we addressed rather than ignore the blatant injustices suffered by women as a consequence of laws or punishments imposed by their fellow men, life would generally improve for everyone, and we would avoid the disintegration of the whole family. Spouses, children, off and outside legal unions, and in our laws have the deleterious impact on a society chained to the old ways and self-destroying attitudes. But in fairness to the much older and wiser men like Aristotle, his definition of a tragic heroine is one who is perceived as both imperfect and somehow guilty of her situation. And in fact, as we watch Andromache and her character plays out with words on stage, she is in motion to accomplish her duty, which is saving the future of Troy. True, the tragic war and her slain husband tend to undermine her role response, which seeks to rise up strong and successful out of the ashes of despair. Songe sont ces filles à cette nuit cruelle, qui fut pour tout un peuple une nuit éternelle. That was an entire nation and a night of unspeakable horror to which most of us patriots can relate. I was by the age of 16, and as part of our liberal education, versed in the history of countries and states, with female leadership, including kings, queens, emperors, and prime ministers. When we take stock of the fact that we have in the US a vice president who is of Indian ancestry, we cannot but recall that India has a long history of women holding political power, including the remarkable Indira Gandhi. On the other hand, about half of Indians surveyed in 2020 say it is more important to teach boys to respect all women. A quarter said it was more important to teach girls to behave more appropriately. The worldwide preoccupation with the Gaza crisis and the war against Hamas killers leads us to consider when Israel was at its prime under the leadership of a female prime minister who defiantly denied the traditional woman role foisted on her. Since childhood, Golda Meir fought to pursue her goals and not be constrained behind cultural absurdity, and so clashed with her parents to pursue an education. Quote, "There is a type of woman who cannot let her husband and children narrow her horizons," she wrote in her memoir. Golda Meir rose to become the Iron Lady of Israel. Her first formal role was ambassador to the Soviet Union, then Labour Minister in 1949. In 1956, she was named Foreign Minister. She flew coach class on diplomatic missions, entertained in her kitchen, forged alliances in regions like Africa, and refused to abide by racial segregation edicts when visiting Rhodesia. She united the two wings of the Labour Party in 1969 and unexpectedly emerged as Israel's first female prime minister. The Queen of Sheba was a wealthy queen, thought to have lived somewhere in either Ethiopia or Yemen. She is important to the holy texts of Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. And she traveled to Israel to meet another wise person in King Solomon, whose wisdom she challenged. In his commentary on the Songs of Solomon, Origen identified, quote, the bride with the queen of the south, that is the Queen of Sheba, who is assumed to be Ethiopian. In Songs of Solomon, chapter 1, verses 5 and 6, it is written, I am black but comely, O ye daughters of Jerusalem, as the tents of Kedar, as the curtains of Solomon. Look not upon me because I am black, because the sun hath looked upon me. My mother's children were angry with me. They made me keeper of the vineyards. But mine own vineyard have I not kept. This story was penned by me on the final day of 2024 Women's History Month, an annual observance to highlight the contributions of women to events in history and contemporary society.
Very good. Oh, that was terrific. Oh.